We'll get started in about another minute or two, so if you want to get settled, if there's anyone out in the hall. Everybody must be right-handed because you're all on this side. Can we take care of that? That's All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Patrick Roberts, and on behalf of the Center for Peace and Transcultural Communication, I'd like to welcome you to this special College of Business Global Passport event that's being offered this evening as part of the Center for Peace's second annual international conference, which took place earlier today, at the Barcema Alumni and Visitors Center. The theme of that conference was Global Problems and Community Praxis, Local, National, and International Approaches to Peace and Transcultural Communication. And we're so very pleased that you could join us, and that also this evening's speaker, Ambassador James Pardew, could join us as well to bring the conference proceedings to a close. So welcome. I also like to welcome students and faculty and staff at our satellite campuses in Naperville and Hoffman Estates as well. Before I turn things over to Acting Provost Dr. Chris McCord, who will introduce our guest speaker this evening, let me just say a few things about the Center for Peace and Transcultural Communication. The center is jointly coordinated by Northern Illinois University and our partners, the University of Tetova in Macedonia. The Center for Peace and Transcultural Communication's mission is to encourage and support scholarship and education related to global issues of peace, reconciliation, human rights, transcultural communication, and interfaith dialogue, and to foster public awareness and understandings of global issues and contexts. And that really was the goal of our conference this afternoon, where we had some very rich conversation and discussion and presentations about many of those issues. And very much looking forward to Ambassador Pardew's presentation in just a few moments as well, as they relate to those issues. As I mentioned, the Center for Peace is jointly coordinated. It's really an expression, the center is really an expression of NIU's commitment to global connection and public service. And we're very fortunate to have in the University of Tetova in Macedonia a partner as committed to those ideals that I just enumerated as NIU is. And so I wonder if you would please join me in just recognizing Professor Dr. Hazir Polajani, who is the Vice Rector of the Division of Scientific Affairs at the University of Tetova, and who is here with some of his colleagues as guests of ours this evening. So, Professor Dr. Polajani. Okay, just before I turn it over, I want to say a few thank yous. I first of all want to thank the University of Tetova and Northern Illinois University, specifically the rector of the University of Tetova, Professor Dr. Volnet Ahmedi, and of course Dr. Lisa Freeman, the acting president of Northern Illinois University. I'd like to thank the NIU College of Business and Dean Raja Gopalan for their support, Anthony Preston for his support as well. I'd like to thank the NIU College of Education and Dean Lori Ellish-Piper for their support. I'd like to thank Dr. Brad Bond and the NIU Division of International Affairs, as well as the NIU Graduate School for their support as well. And Now I'd like to turn it over to Acting Provost, Dr. Chris McCord, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you for all your work and those of your the work of your colleagues in organizing today's event. On behalf of Acting President Lisa Freeman, I'm pleased to welcome all of you to Northern Illinois University. Vice President Polishani and your colleagues, we're so glad to see you here. We hope we'll continue to do so. And it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. Ambassador James Pardew has over 40 years of public service, including 28 years in the U.S. Army and 23 years in civilian service. His military service, beginning in the 1960s, took him around the world, from Japan to Vietnam to Turkey to Somalia to Germany. His civilian service has focused on the Balkans, where he's been part of some of the most dramatic moments in the region's history. He participated in the 1995 Dayton Peace Accords that helped end the war in Bosnia. From 1999 to 2001, Ambassador Pardew was the Deputy Special Advisor to the President and Secretary of State for the Democracy in the Balkans during the NATO conflict in Kosovo and the subsequent peace settlement. He assisted in establishing U.S. and international civil presences in Kosovo and in the development of local Kosovo institutions of government and security. In 2001, he served as U.S. negotiator for the Ohrid Agreement, preventing a civil war in Macedonia. It's a remarkable career who can look at and say 3 major peace settlements in a region in the span of one career, in the span of a decade. In addition to these remarkable experiences, Ambassador Pardew has served as director for the U.S. Military Train and Equip program in Bosnia from 1996 to 1999. He served as U.S. ambassador to Bulgaria in 2002 to 2005, when Bulgaria was admitted to NATO and completed its accession negotiations for European Union membership. And finally, as Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Operations, NATO International Staff from August 2005 to August 2008 during NATO operations in Afghanistan, Kosovo, and the NATO training mission in Iraq. All of these experiences have informed Ambassador Pardew's book, Peacemakers, American Leadership and the End of Genocide in the Balkans. Ambassador Pardew is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. He's a recipient of the Department of State Distinguished Honor Award, the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Civil Service, the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal. His military decorations include the Defense Superior Service Medal, twice receiving the Legion of Merit, twice receiving a Bronze Star, and receiving the Air Medal. In addition, he's been granted the Stara Planina Medal by the President of Bulgaria. A native of Arkansas, Mr. Pardew is a graduate from the U.S. Army War College. He holds an MA in Political Science from Loyola University of Chicago and a BS degree in Journalism from Arkansas State University. Ambassador Pardew and his wife Kathy have 3 sons. It's my great pleasure to welcome Ambassador Pardew, who will speak on the United States and the World Today, Lessons from the Balkans. Please.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. McCord. I'm very delighted this evening to address the 2018 International Conference on Approaches to Peace and Transcultural Communications. This is an important international meeting on one of the most critical issues facing modern nations, the relationship between cultures in a world that is quickly becoming more and more diverse. The heartland of America has a vital interest in how the United States engages in this increasingly diverse world, and I congratulate Northern Illinois University on focusing and concentrating its discussion today on this major foreign policy issue. I also want to recognize Northern Illinois' contribution to higher education through its relationship with the State University of Tetovo. This direct cooperation between institutions like NIU and universities and organizations of new nations in the Balkan region has a deep and lasting impact on an area still recovering from years of communist rule and armed conflict. Yesterday, I landed at O'Hare Airport. My wife and I lived in Chicago for 3 years, back a long time ago when I was teaching ROTC at DePaul University. So I got off the airport yesterday, and the temperature was hovering around freezing, and it was beginning to snow, and so I reminded myself of how delightful the spring can be in the Chicago metropolitan area. My presentation tonight is drawn from my book, Peacemakers, which is shamelessly promoted on the slide to my rear. The point of reference this evening is my experience at the center of U.S.-led international intervention in the Balkans from 1995 during the breakup of Yugoslavia until Kosovo declared independence in 2008. It's a great story. It's full of drama, very fascinating characters, heroes and villains, lots of intrigue. But I'm not going to focus on the military and diplomatic details of Balkan negotiations tonight, but rather I want to do two things. I want to first talk about the consequences of the U.S. engagement in this troubled region in this period. And secondly, I want to pass on to you some lessons that I took away from this experience that I think might be important to American foreign policy and diplomacy in the world ahead. Now, the Balkan region has a reputation for being very complex and sometimes baffling. But years ago, when I was a young officer in the Pentagon, I had to go brief a particularly difficult general. And as I started into my briefing, he stopped me and he said, "Major, stop." He said, "The purpose of intellectual activity is to simplify the complex, not the other way around." So I've taken the general's advice on how to approach this subject, and my objective is to clarify the U.S. engagement in the Balkans during the breakup of Yugoslavia. So let me begin by providing some context. The history of the Balkans is mingled with the history of the great powers of Western civilization. In fact, there's no other area of Europe that has seen more the comings and goings, the ebb and flow of great civilizations important to the development of Western civilization than this region. This is the land of ancient Greeks, of Philip and Alexander the Great, of Rome, Byzantium, the Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarians. We all know that World War I began when the Archduke was assassinated in Sarajevo. Nazi Germany controlled most of the area during World War II, and then it fell under Soviet influence in the Cold War. Each of these great powers left behind bits and pieces of their own culture that has an imprint on the region today. The nation of Yugoslavia was created at the end of World War I in the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and it stayed together as the Federation of Southern Slavs from that period up until 1989, and when communism began, when the Berlin Wall fell and communism began to collapse in Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia began to fly apart. Now, the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, and many of you are too young to remember that, but it was one of the great events, I think, in human history that such a great, large, and powerful empire came apart, and it was almost all peaceful. The one exception to that was the breakup of Yugoslavia. The wars that accompanied the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s were the deadliest conflicts in Europe since World War II, and they featured a level of genocide not seen since the Holocaust in Europe. An estimated 110,000 people lost their lives, and over 3 million people became refugees or were displaced. The United States avoided this conflict from 1992, when it broke out in Bosnia, until 1995, and stayed on the sidelines, and this created great tensions in the NATO alliance and with our partners. But in the summer of 1995, an event took place which changed all that, and that was the Srebrenica massacre, in which Bosnian Serb soldiers killed 8,000 men and boys in a genocidal act in this small town in eastern Bosnia. The United States could no longer stay outside this conflict, and President Clinton committed Richard Holbrooke to go find a peaceful solution. I've highlighted here 3 major events, 3 major areas of U.S. engagement in this time. The first is the Holbrooke diplomatic mission that achieved the Dayton Agreement and ended this deadly conflict in Europe, which killed 100,000. The second is the NATO air campaign in Kosovo. After Bosnia was settled, war broke out in Kosovo in 1998 and 9. An extensive diplomatic effort was tried to stop and prevent that war. I was a part of that, and it failed. And after very extensive diplomacy failed, NATO was committed to a 78-day air campaign that expelled Serbian military and police forces out of Kosovo and set the stage for Kosovo's independence several years later. And then the last one was the one I was most directly involved in, and that was the Ohrid Agreement, which prevented a civil war that our friends from Tetovo know very, very well. The U.S. engagement in the Balkans in this time was a major foreign policy success for the United States. It stopped a war in Bosnia that included genocide and crimes against humanity. It ended a deadly humanitarian crisis in Kosovo, and it prevented a war in Macedonia. Overall, it restored peace and stability to close to 50 million people in the Western Balkans, and it enabled the creation of 7 new nations, most of them oriented toward NATO membership in the European Union, and democracy. This engagement also reestablished America's leadership in Europe on a critical security issue. The Bosnia engagement was the high water mark of U.S.-Russian relations in the post-Soviet period. The cooperation on Bosnia was extensive between the United States, European allies, and the Russian government. At that time, it was Gorbachev to Yeltsin. But once Putin came to power in 1999, the relationship between the United States and Russia started to deteriorate, and it has continued to deteriorate until we have this very confrontational situation we have today. The breakup of Yugoslavia also transformed a number of international organizations. NATO in 1995 was a military alliance focused on defending Central Europe from an invasion by Soviet military forces. By becoming engaged in the Balkans, NATO was transformed from a Cold War institution to one that was capable of responding to security requirements of the United States and our European allies anywhere in the world. It set the stage for NATO's engagement in Afghanistan, in Libya, and Iraq. The air campaign in Bosnia and Kosovo were the first actual combat operations by this great alliance that had gone 50 years of deterrence and never fired a shot. We worked with Russian troops on the ground in Bosnia for the first time ever, and only a few years earlier, the idea that Russian soldiers could work side by side with American forces in a common operation was unthinkable. This was revolutionary stuff. In 95, the European Union had no political identity. It was largely an economic institution. through its engagement in the Balkans, they created essentially a foreign minister, a high representative for common security and foreign policy for the European Union, and they provided them a staff. The European Union was involved in developmental activities in Bosnia and Kosovo. EU soldiers replaced NATO in Bosnia when NATO moved on to Kosovo. And so it revolutionized that institution as well. The United Nations had a terrible experience in UNPROFOR in Bosnia. It largely failed. But it recovered from that in Kosovo. The UN governed Kosovo for 8 years, leading up to its independence. In addition to that, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, the War Crimes Tribunal, indicted 161 people for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and so forth. 80 of them were convicted and sent to jail. The people who were brought before justice included a president of a nation, a former president, a sitting prime minister of a nation, and various generals and ministers of the governments involved. Again, this was a pretty revolutionary stuff, all of it coming out of the Balkans. Today, the new nations born from the former Yugoslavia have many serious political issues and developmental problems. The transition to peace and stability in the Western Balkans is far from over. In fact, it may take generations. But the new democracies emerging from the former Yugoslavia, and this is directly applicable to the conference that you're having today, represent a great experiment in the concept that the rights of people are defined by their individual citizenship and not by their race, religion, or ethnicity. It is a great experiment and an unusual one for this region. Is this idealistic? Absolutely, of course it is. But it's the best alternative to the ethnic wars and division that have plagued this region forever. So my experience in the former Yugoslavia led me to several conclusions on the future of U.S. national security and foreign policy. At the top of that list is the critical importance of American leadership and of American values. Without the American involvement from 1992 until 1995, the international program to stop the killing in Bosnia was fragmented, indecisive, and weak, and the war grew more and more destructive and tragic. That situation changed when the United States became directly engaged in Bosnia, and that engagement mobilized, focused, and energized the international effort and restored peace and stability to the region. American values were at the core of the process that achieved peace in the Balkans. And American democratic values are a source of inspiration and influence around the world. And they should always be a priority component of our foreign and national security policy. If the United States does not stand consistently for democracy and human rights around the world, I ask you, who will? We should make clear to autocratic leaders like Putin, Xi Jinping in China, and Erdogan in Turkey, and others that we will not ignore violations of the key components of democracy and human rights in their nations. Another lesson for me is the importance of Europe and NATO. The United States has other important, even vital relationships around the world, but none is as critical to our security as the bond with the democracies in Europe. And in that regard, the greatest security coalition for the United States is with Canada and our European allies committed to NATO. Any real separation of the United States from our European allies and NATO will put the security of all at great risk. The importance of international organizations is another lesson. Success in the Balkans was an example of U.S. leadership of a broad international coalition consisting of key allies and international institutions like NATO, the European Union, the United Nations, OSCE, and others. There's a lot of shallow hostility in Washington these days about international organizations. In truth, these organizations are only as powerful as the nations allow them to be. They have many weaknesses, and if you've worked with them, you can recognize them, and they have their limitations. But the advantage of working within international institutions is enormous. They reduce the cost to the United States of our foreign commitments, and they provide international legitimacy that you cannot get anywhere else. We always have the option, this country, of unilateral action, acting alone. But that choice is far more dangerous and costly than multilateral cooperation like that employed in the Balkans in the period I'm discussing. Another lesson is the relationship between diplomacy and the military. The success of U.S. policy during the breakup of Yugoslavia was led by activist diplomacy and supported and reinforced by very selective and careful use of military force when diplomacy could not accomplish the task. NATO air campaign in Kosovo came only after all diplomatic options had failed, and later U.S. and EU diplomacy prevented a civil war in Macedonia. For the United States, a military-dominated foreign policy is often dangerous and counterproductive. One thing is certain: military force alone will not solve every international problem that threatens our interest. And I think this is particularly true as we struggle with the threat of Islamic extremism today. Another lesson for me is the role of the United States in humanitarian crises like those in the Balkans. I believe that humanitarian intervention is consistent with American values and supports our national interests. The U.S. cannot and should not jump headlong into every humanitarian crisis, but the level of American power gives us a unique opportunity to lead or mobilize international humanitarian actions when national interests are at stake and when other options are no longer available. As an example, a U.S.-led humanitarian intervention in Iraq and possibly Syria, I think, is appropriate to address the desperate humanitarian crisis in areas liberated from ISIS control. An American humanitarian effort there would directly discredit the extremist anti-American propaganda around the world in Muslim societies and would relieve the refugee pressure on Europe in general and on the Balkans in particular. Corruption is a lesson that has a continuing relevance in the Balkan region, where corruption is a major issue today. For the military assistance program that I ran, we operated under very strict rules and regulations about how we managed international money to ensure that none of it leaked out into corrupt hands. And that experience convinced me that we should be much more stern about applying such practices to every international assistance program that we run. I believe that corruption, the use of public position for personal gain, is the greatest single threat to democracy today, including to our own. Corruption makes a mockery of the rule of law and of democratic values in general. And the United States should never, ever turn a blind eye to corruption by foreign recipients and assistance programs as the cost of doing business. The last of my personal lessons from the Balkans is also tied directly to this conference that was held today, and that is the reality of diversity in modern life. The Balkan experience convinced me that diversity is a fact of life in modern societies. With today's instantaneous flow of information, ease of travel, economic integration, Nations can no longer operate and function in the isolation of the past. Now, does this mean open borders? Of course not. What I'm really advocating is an acceptance of the reality of diversity that exists and will continue to exist and grow even more diverse in the future. In this age of diversity, future unity and strength of democratic nations will be determined not by race and ethnicity, but by shared political and social values and by the equality of justice and opportunity for those citizens. Nations that draw on the positive aspects of all groups within the generally accepted democratic values will, in the long run, have the greatest chance of security and growth. Those which cannot accommodate diversity, in my view, are doomed to eternal disunity and conflict. Now, this is a good place for me to talk about my favorite negotiation, which is the Ohrid Agreement. And I'll say a few words about Ohrid, which prevented the civil war in Macedonia, by addressing the ethnic and cultural issues that threaten peace there. When Francois Léotard of France, and he was representing the European Union, and I arrived in Skopje in the beginning of July in 2001, the country of Macedonia was on the verge of a civil war that would have been destructive as any other in the Balkans and probably would have destroyed Macedonia as a country. But by 2001, because of our experience in Bosnia, because of our experience in Kosovo and other places in the region, the United States and our European partners had learned a lot about the conflicts and negotiations and what worked and what didn't work and what would offer the most promise for the future. And so I would just want to note some elements of the Ohrid Agreement that I think are important. First, the Ohrid Agreement rejects territorial solutions to solve ethnic conflict. We did not try to divide up Macedonia into ethnic regions as happened in Bosnia with essentially ethnic entities. The Ohrid Agreement makes a commitment for all the parties to a unified federal nation of Macedonia, and it does not divide the nation. It strengthens local authority over local issues. Ohrid gives greater recognition to culture, identity, and language of the Albanian minority while retaining the unity of the nation. And we can go into some of that in the Q&A if you'd like. And it seeks a fair representation in national institutions like the police, the military, and others. The Ohrid Agreement is not perfect. No compromise agreement ever is, but I'm personally proud of my role in helping achieve it. And I'm also very proud of the national leaders in Macedonia, the Albanians and the Slavic Macedonian group. Those leaders had the courage to actually do this, to make the compromises that were necessary to bring peace to their country. So, the period of American leadership in the Balkans was the high point of American influence in the world in the post-Soviet period. The intervention during the breakup of Yugoslavia represents American leadership at its very best, and it sets a very high standard for the country as we engage in the world today. The American commitment to peace in the Balkans was based on democratic and humanitarian values and our common national interest. American policy focused on close cooperation with European partners and international organizations. Diplomacy led the way, but it was supported by military force when required. As this experience in the Balkans shows, the American foreign policy that provided leadership and international success in restoring peace in the former Yugoslavia was vastly different from the Trump administration's approach to foreign and national security policy today. Based on my experiences, I have to join other professional foreign policy and national security people who are sounding the alarm about the current direction of U.S. foreign policy and the related decline in American influence around the world. American leadership is in question today, not because of our weakness of our ideals and our values, or because of economic or military weaknesses, or by flaws in our national structure. Our influence is in question today because of the unilateralist and nationalist path of the current administration. The United States and Western Europe have flourished for decades within a common multilateral approach to international affairs. Unilateralism has never been an effective policy for the United States, and it is not a path to greater strength and security today. Internationally, we should not be confused about who are our friends and who are our adversaries. As I mentioned earlier, our most critical allies are democratic nations who share our values and organizations like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which has defended those values for decades. Authoritarian rulers, demagogues, and tyrants despise the Western democracy, and Russia clearly interfered with the U.S. elections for the purpose of undermining our system of government and separating us from our European allies. Russia or anyone else who acts to disrupt our democracy or that of our allies must face serious penalties. Of course, we should have straightforward, practical relationships with Russia, China, and other autocratic nations when practical, but we should do that on our terms, on our conditions, not theirs. The American influence in the world on the long run will be decided by our own confidence in democracy and in the institutions of our government that ensure it. Unwarranted political attacks on our elections and on institutions critical to our democracy and our security undermine that confidence. If our professional institutions of government become politicized and Americans lose faith in the American justice system, in the FBI, the intelligence community, and the free and independent press, then our democracy is in grave danger, and we will become no better than authoritarian governments like those in Russia, China, and Turkey. As a former U.S. Special Envoy, I am particularly concerned about the chaos in the foreign policy establishment of the United States today. We are now on our third National Security Advisor for this administration. The Secretary of State is not in place. The Director of Central Intelligence is in question. Major ambassadorships and senior positions at the State Department are vacant. The State Department budget has been slashed. Top diplomats have left, and the State Department has little credibility to speak for the President. The damage to these institutions of American diplomacy must be repaired, and the sooner the better. Despite the present decline in American influence around the world, I remain hopeful. U.S. institutions of democracy are robust, and the nation has an exceptional capacity for self-correction that many other nations do not, and I think that process of self-correction is ongoing. For me, I believe that a kind of tough-minded idealism and core democratic values can prevail and get America through this current period of confusion. And the United States will return to the principles and relationships that brought peace to the Balkans, and will again assume its international leadership that the world so badly needs. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. We have time for questions, so I'd like to ask if you have a question to raise your hand, and we will get a microphone over to you. Questions?
Thank you, Ambassador Pardew, for that. Thank you, Ambassador Pardew, for that wonderful talk. And I learned a lot about this really incredibly bewildering, complex part of the world. My question has to do with your assessment of these authoritarian tendencies as they may be manifesting in Macedonia today. these authoritarian tendencies that we see in Hungary, the United States, etc. What's the situation in the Balkans in general?
It's not just the Balkans. There's a trend in Europe today that to me is very troubling, particularly in Eastern Europe, where Hungary and Poland have reverted back to a more authoritarian approach to governance. Not completely authoritarian governments, but there is kind of a strongman approach. There is this temptation of what I refer to as authoritarian capitalism, in which you seek economic development, but you do it within an authoritarian structure, kind of like the Chinese model. It would be pretty much kind of what Putin would like to do in Russia. And that is being fostered because of an atmosphere of fear, which has heightened the appeal of extreme nationalism. A lot of that comes out of the refugee crisis that is taking place in Europe. These refugees that are flowing out of the war in Iraq and are frankly destabilizing the political structure, because we're talking about millions of people. And it's unsettling to nations all over Europe. But in some places, in Poland and Hungary particularly, they've moved in the wrong direction. And it's a trend I think we need to worry about. Not too many people pay that much attention to it. This destabilization is particularly acute in the Balkans, where you have a Muslim, non-Muslim tension to begin with as part of the ethnic structure there. It's not just religion. As I say, I was raised a Southern Baptist in Arkansas. I know something about religious hypocrisy. And it was everywhere in the Balkans. So religion took on a political character. It was all about political power. But it also heightened this business of ethnic identity and the concern about all these people coming out of Iraq, and it created some instability. I think if the United States and Western Europe, particularly Western Europe, does not pay close attention, a lot of the progress that we made in the Balkans could slide backwards. Now, I do think membership in the NATO and membership in the EU is an incredible incentive for these nations to stay stable and move forward. I don't think we're about to return to war in the Balkans. We're far, far from that. But it does heighten tensions, and it increases the potential it retards the development of rule of law and some other things that are critical to the development of democracy there. That's a long answer to your question, but it's a complex issue.
Ambassador, I have a question from a viewer in Naperville, if I might. They ask, why do you believe a European solution to a European humanitarian crisis failed to make a timely appearance to solve the 92-95 events? And why does American intervention seem necessary to solve Europe's greatest historical challenges, for example, World War I, World War II, et cetera?
Well, I think our experience in the 20th century showed that the United States has a very deep interest in European peace and stability. If it's not peaceful and stable, we saw what happened twice in that century. Europe was led by the United States throughout the Cold War period. From 1945 until the fall of the Berlin Wall, the United States was a leader of Western democracies. We walked away from that, frankly, after the wall came down, and the Europeans were not yet ready to accept that leadership role. The EU was not a fully formed institution. They didn't have a common foreign policy structure. And what happened was they started jockeying for power between themselves, and they tended to fall back on 19th century behaviors. Certain countries supported the Serbs, certain countries supported the the Croats, the Muslims were isolated and went elsewhere to find support, mainly in the Islamic world. And then they never gave the United Nations the power and authority to actually do the job. So the UN had a weak mandate, a bad security structure. There was no real consistent diplomacy, and it was fragmented and disorganized. When we set off on the sidelines and criticized the Europeans, but they were resentful of that because they had troops on the ground and we didn't. And so the tensions were really strained between the United States and Europe, and that showed in NATO. Had we not intervened, I think the war in Bosnia would have gotten a lot worse, and we could have had much bigger conflicts in the rest of the area. I am not critical of the Europeans for not stepping into the vacuum that we created. We created that vacuum, and then we had to come back in and fill it in a very short order. And I don't think there was any real substitute for that. Had we let it go, a lot more people would have been killed, and the conflicts there could have spread outside the former Yugoslavia into the rest of the southeastern Europe.
I think we have a question right here, and then we'll go to Baton.
I have a question for you, actually, about Bosnia and the Dayton Accords. Many people in the almost 25 years since the Accords have started looking back at them as, having very successfully ended the violence in Bosnia, but created a situation in Bosnia where there's also no future for the country, where they're stuck in political limbo without a stable government, without real independence, in fact, because of the High Representative. And I was wondering, looking back at the Dayton Accords, are there things that mistakes that you think we should avoid in the future? Are there alternatives that you think we could have implemented at the time? And how did you carry those lessons forward in Macedonia?
Yeah, the first thing to know about the Dayton Accords is that the purpose of those negotiations, first and foremost, was to stop the killing, stop the conflict, and that was the overriding factor. Now, the Dayton Accords is clearly flawed. It sets up a very, very weak central government and two more powerful sub-states. One of those states, the Republic of Srpska, fights every day to weaken the state. And Holbrooke knew that, and we didn't know it was going to be as bad as it turned out to be. But we knew we were creating a state with a central government that was unnecessarily weak. But we couldn't get it done any other way. I mean, that was probably the major condition from the Serb viewpoint to sign the agreement. Holbrooke had a lot of second guessing himself after that was all over. Should we have banned the old political parties? A more cruel one was we stopped the Croatian offensive in western Bosnia that would have driven most of the Serbs out of Bosnia. And we, the United States, stopped that offensive. He said, did we do the right thing? Well, actually, I think we did. Had we not stopped it, Bosnia would have been ethnically cleansed. There would have been very few Serbs left in the country, and we would have been as guilty as others in ethnically cleansing Bosnia. So there was a rationale there. Also, it would have destabilized Milosevic, and Milosevic was the key component of signing the agreement. So we can look back at it and find a lot of things that we would have liked to have done better. We recognized at the time that there was some question. There was the great hope that political leaders, as they developed, would look at their own situation and make the necessary changes to make their country better because they have the means to do it. They just choose not to. That has not happened. And Bosnia, quite frankly, is a sad place today because it's not developing. Young people are leaving and all of that. And what really is tragic about all this is I look at Bosnia today and I see the same old leaders in many places that were there in 1995 when I was running around with Holbrooke. And Milorad Dodik, the head of the Republic of Srpska, was a political figure back in those days. So I think there needs to be a new level of political leadership certainly in Bosnia. Again, as I said, I think this may be a generational thing that may take more than one generation to fix. I don't see it breaking out into war, but they need to solve their own problems and they have the means to do it. They just don't have the will to do it yet. And hopefully some leaders with some will come in and solve it.
We'll take a question right here, and then we'll hear from a viewer in Naperville, and then we'll go to the back of the room.
Fato Shabani, colleague of Law, University of Tetova. Honorable Ambassador, I have one question. Do you think from today's point of view, do you think that these states from Bosnia, Kosovo to Macedonia have fulfilled your expectations?
Okay. Let me go back to one more element of her question too, and that is what lessons did we learn? When I went to Macedonia to try to prevent a war there, I was absolutely determined that we would not create a Republic of Srpska in Macedonia. No way were we going to do that again. And I mean, that's just one of the lessons that we learned, but there was a learning process that carried forward into these other things. I actually am kind of optimistic about Macedonia. Most of the things have been implemented, or they're in various stages of implementation. It's not perfect. There's a lot of give and go, a lot of push and shove, a lot of angry political hostility, but we can't be very critical of anybody these days for a lot of political wrangling in the world. I think if the name issue is resolved in Macedonia with Greece, and if Macedonia receives its rightful place in NATO and heads to EU membership, I think the constructive Albanian citizenship and political parties and educations like Tetova University will actually provide the means for that country to grow and expand, and so I'm optimistic about Macedonia. I'm not so optimistic about other places like Bosnia, for example. But in Macedonia, I think the country, despite all the headaches of implementation, has moved the process forward. Could it have been done faster? Sure. But, you know, it's moving in the right direction.
We have a question from a viewer in Naperville. Do you agree with the recent military intervention in the Middle East? How would you handle that situation?
Well, if I had a good answer for that, I would probably be Secretary of something or other. A lot of mistakes have been made in the Middle East. I think the war in Iraq was a terrible mistake by the United States. And it destabilized the region, and I think we're seeing more of that today. But I don't want to just be critical of the Bush administration. I think that President Obama should never have drawn a red line and not implemented that red line. I think there were mistakes made. I don't believe in starting off a difficult situation by demanding regime change as the place to start. I think that was a big mistake. So a lot of mistakes have been made. The question is, what do we do now? Well, I gave you my first step would be for the United States. I mean, we've been dropping a lot of bombs over there. We have essentially run ISIS out of the power in the region. There is no caliphate. But it's not enough for us to just drop bombs. We need to, not us alone, but we need to mobilize an international effort, a humanitarian effort, to try to get these people back to their homes and try to stem the flow of refugees and return these people to their homes so that they can re-establish their lives. I would start with that. I would internationalize this as much as possible. Russia's Russia. You have to deal with it. I would no longer talk about regime change with Assad and all that. I would try to get some kind of negotiations going. So we have to walk away from some decisions that we've made in the past. We need to take a more humanitarian approach to it, and we need to internationalize the whole area and try to get some kind of negotiated solution. Now, there are all kinds of other issues at play here. There's Iran, there's Saudi Arabia, there's Yemen, and so this is the security and diplomatic problem from hell, and it's going to take a long time and a lot of thoughtful people working together to solve it, and the United States cannot do it alone, that's for sure. I mean, the Middle East is a place that has seen a lot of great powers come, and most of them have left licking their wounds, and I don't want us to be the next episode of that. So I just think we're going to have to eat this elephant one bite at a time, as they say, and try to break it down into bits and pieces that we can deal with and move forward. I'm not sure that, again, I was been very critical of the current administration, but with the chaos that we have in the foreign policy establishment today, I think what I'm describing is almost an impossible task, because I'm telling you, our foreign policy establishment's in a state of chaos, and that has to be fixed. And you know, taunting and name calling and huffing and puffing, it's not, these problems are too hard, and they require capable, professional, seasoned people to help work it out.
We have a question back here. And as the microphone makes its way all the way in the back, raise your hand so she can see you. Let me take a second to say that copies of Ambassador Pardew's book are for sale in the lobby on your way out. So be sure to pick them up, and you probably can talk him into signing a book for you as well.
Okay, I'm from Colombia, and right now my country is struggling with the post-conflict phase. So my question is, from your lessons, what do you think is very important from the guarantor's country and from the business perspective to support the legitimacy of the agreement?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Right now my country is in the post-conflict phase.
Yeah, right, okay.
So the question is, from the lessons from the Balkans, what do you consider was clue or very important from the guarantors, countries, and the companies to secure and to support the agreement?
Well, I think economic development solves so many problems, and economic development in the Balkans is a real problem. You know, in 2008, when Kosovo got its independence and pretty much ended the breakup of Yugoslavia, the world economy went over a cliff, and so the whole region, you know, Europe in general, but the Balkans suffered particularly because of that, and we're just now recovering from that. So economic development is a major source of stability in all of these countries. We have young people that need jobs and so forth. Now, I'm a diplomat. I'm not an economic person. I think that for the Balkans, membership in the EU provides a lot of funding which will help these countries stabilize and move forward. So I'm in favor of very quickly moving toward EU membership for most of the countries in the Balkans. The EU is more cautious on this than I am, but I don't know enough about Colombia to speak to the economic development, but it is the critical area of long-term stability in a post-conflict society.
We have another question from a viewer in Naperville. Do you think that we will ever have a peaceful relationship with Russia? And if so, what do you think needs to be done to accomplish that?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question today. I wrote an op-ed that was in the DeKalb Daily Chronicle a couple days ago about the need, how I would structure a proper relationship to Russia. I worked very closely with Russians in Bosnia. Got to know Igor Ivanov, who later became the foreign minister of Russia after Macedonia. I tell this story. I went to brief the Russians in Moscow about our Ohrid agreement, and Ivanov, who I met at Dayton and got to know and get friends with him, invited me to come up to his office, and so I went up to visit the foreign minister of Russia in his office there in Moscow, and I'm sitting there, and we're gossiping about Holbrooke and all kinds of stuff, and I'm sitting there thinking to myself, wow, this is the office of Andrei Gromyko and all those foreign ministers from the old days of the Cold War. This is a long way from Jonesboro, Arkansas, where I grew up. Can we work with the Russians? Absolutely we can. We have, and in the future I think we will. But Mr. Putin makes it very hard to do that. Presidents from Bill Clinton to Donald Trump have tried to reset the relationship with them and has failed because it is in Putin's interest to promote fear and xenophobia to stabilize his own political position in Russia. So I think, I mean, the West stands ready to work with them, but when Russia misbehaves, they have to be held accountable for it, and they have to have consequences when they violate our interests. And so I think we work practically with Russia. We open a hand to them, and they are welcome, and we should draw them in when they're willing to do that. But when they attack us as they did in 2016, as they continue to do today, killing people in London and all that's got to stop, and they should pay serious penalties for all of that. But on the long run, I think we have common interests. I think Russia is a tough country to govern because of its size and complexity. But in the long run, I think it is in our interest and frankly in the interest of Russia for us to all get along. And that's entirely possible. There's no reason not to work with the Russians.
Do we have a question over here?
Hi, I was just wondering what your opinion is on Brexit and what you think the potential spillover effects it would create as a result of it happening in regions like the Balkans and currently the Central European nations like Poland and Hungary, and also what your general opinion of it is.
Well, I'm a believer in the European Union. I think it's great for Europe. I certainly don't fear it. I think Britain's decision to withdraw from the European Union was a mistake. And I think many citizens of the UK also think it was a mistake. If they held a vote again, they might not do it. But again, this business of diversity and fear and immigrants coming into your country and all this kind of stuff kind of destabilized the political system in the UK, and they voted for nationalism. And I think they didn't fully consider the consequences. I don't know how that'll work out. You know, it's their decision. If they want to leave, fine. I think European Union can function without them. I don't see it holding back anybody who wants to get in the European Union. You know, they're lined up at the door to get in. It changes the leadership structure of Europe a bit in that the UK is not there to assert its leadership influence in the EU. But all in all, I think the EU is good for Europe, good for democracy, good for the United States, and I really wish them well, and I think we should support it.
We have time for maybe two more quick questions. This gentleman over here. And then
You're good.
the booming voice.
Well, you may need it on their tape.
They need it for the other campuses.
So, what conditions do you think had to be met to allow us to engage in the Balkans that were not present during the Rwandan genocide a year prior to this?
Well, we are a reluctant, I mean, historically, we're kind of reluctant to get involved in these kinds of things. I mean, we were reluctant to get into World War I, we were reluctant to get into World War II, we were reluctant to get into Bosnia. We should have gotten into Rwanda, no question about it. I think it's kind of a characteristic of ours to believe that somehow we can just stay aloof from these kind of things. But in the leadership position that we have been in and should be in the future, I think we don't have to do it all, but staying out of a lot of these things, if we are going to stand for human rights and for democracy, then I think we have not only capability, but also somewhat of a responsibility. And that's why international institutions are important. To the degree that we can get the UN, the EU, and others to carry the burden here, then it's a matter of just working out the details. And I make no excuses for Rwanda. I'm sure we should have done more sooner.
So the last question we'll take from one of the viewers in either Naperville or Hoffman Estates. And they ask, could you share a very stressful but funny anecdote from any one of the important meetings that you attended? Thank you.
Oh my goodness.
Something you could share, you don't mind sharing.
Something I could share.
The rest of us.
Let me think about that. Something funny. Well, let's see.
Maybe diplomacy is no laughing matter. Right?
Well, I'm not much of a comedian. I don't know. Holbrook, we came out of we were in Belgrade one day, and we'd been on the road for several days, and Holbrook was a magnet for the media. I mean, he knew the media, he used the media effectively, he loved the media, they loved him. It was a moth to flame, both sides. And so we're standing there waiting to go to a meeting, and he walks up to me and he says, Jim, give me your tie. And I said, sure, boss, whatever you want, you know. But can I ask you why you want my tie? He said, yeah, my wife called me and she said, I've been wearing the same tie on television for the last 4 days, and she wants a different tie. Not a hilarious story. I need more advanced
Sure.
warning on the joke stuff. Yeah, not all of it was serious. There were some moments. There were some really serious moments. I'll keep thinking.
All right, well, let us know if anything bubbles up. And in the meantime, please give a round of applause to Ambassador James Pardew.
Thank you.
Ambassador, I just want to, on behalf of NIU and the Center for Peace and Transcultural Communication, thank you for your public service. We really need more public servants like you. And now I believe there are some presentations. Vice Rector Polajani, I think, would like to present you with a gift from the University of Tatava, and then Dr. McCord will present you with something from NIU.
Good. Oh, Skinder Bey.
Yes.
All right, great Albanian figure. Great. Thank you so much.
have a small gift from NIU.
Oh.
Not as dramatic, but with husky paw prints on it.
All right, go Huskies. All right.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you again. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thanks to our viewers from Naperville and Hoffman Estates. And please do stop by the table outside where you'll find copies of Peacemakers. And have a good evening, all.
Okay.
Thank you.
You okay? You all right?
It was excellent.